In the quiet suburbs of Willow Lane, a 911 call leads police to a bloody and chaotic scene inside Henry Rowan's home. Cece Ye, a middle-aged Asian woman, is found covered in blood, screaming in hysteria, while her daughter Annie Rowan cowers in the bathroom, terrified. Henry himself lies wounded in the hallway, barely conscious. It seems like a case of domestic violence gone wrong, but as the investigation unfolds, the truth turns out to be far more sinister. The sleepy suburban street of Willow Lane had always been a quiet one, where neighbors exchanged pleasantries over white picket fences and the hum of lawnmowers filled the air on summer weekends. But tonight was different. The tranquil facade was shattered by flashing police lights, casting eerie red and blue reflections off the houses. The stillness was disturbed, the soft whir of the patrol car's engine drowned out by the heavy thud of Officer Daniel's boots hitting the pavement. "Dispatch said there was screaming blood and maybe something worse," Officer Rivera said, tightening his grip on his flashlight. They exchanged a brief glance before heading up the path to number 343. The front door hung slightly ajar, a crack of dim light spilling into the darkness. Inside, chaos reigned. The quiet neighborhood they had once known was unrecognizable. Blood smeared across the walls in jagged streaks, broken glass crunched beneath their feet, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of violence. In the hallway, a man lay trembling on the floor, his clothes soaked with blood. Policeman commanded, "Down!" But the man, in pure horror, jumped to another room. Rivera had no other options but to shoot him from a stun gun. Man fell paralyzed. "Henry Rowan," Rivera muttered, recognizing the man. Henry was overweight, a middle-aged white man who had never caused trouble before, now lying amidst a scene of devastation. A few feet away from him lay a stun gun and what looked like a whip. The sight was bizarre, surreal. From the kitchen, the sound of hysterical sobbing echoed through the house. Officer Daniels moved cautiously toward the noise, his flashlight illuminating the figure of a middle-aged Asian woman, Cece Ye, her face swollen with bruises, her clothes splattered with blood. She was screaming incoherently, her voice a raw, frantic wail. Daniels called for backup, the tension in his chest tightening as he realized this wasn't an ordinary domestic disturbance. In the bathroom, huddled in the corner, was a younger woman, curled up into herself, her body shaking uncontrollably. Annie Rowan, Henry's ex-wife. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, her sobs barely audible over the chaos around her. Who was the aggressor? Who had been attacked? The lack of clear evidence and conflicting emotions swirled around them, leaving the officers in a complex situation. As they secured the scene, it was clear that they had no concrete idea of who the primary suspect was. The conflicting narratives, the visible injuries, and the emotional turmoil made it impossible to ascertain the truth at that moment. The police made a decision to detain everyone involved to gather more information, hoping to sort out the details in a controlled environment where the violence of the moment could be de-escalated. Realizing that they had a volatile scene in front of them with a bloodied man and two frightened women, the lead officer decided to exercise caution. For the sake of safety and because Henry was indeed a male in a situation featuring violence against two females. Henry was placed in the back seat of a police car, blood trickling from his wounds. Confusion and fear gripped him as he realized he was seen as the primary suspect. His eyes were wide open and he screamed to everyone passing by the car, "Where is Marie? What did they do to Marie?" Nearby, Cece was in an ambulance, surprisingly calm as paramedics treated her injuries. On the lawn, Annie sat handcuffed. Her face was emotionless, could appeal as she struggled to process the horrific events. But the police had yet to discover the blood-chilling detail hidden in the barn next to the house in this quiet neighborhood. Willow Lane was the kind of place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. Henry Rowan had chosen this neighborhood deliberately. After his divorce from Annie Rowan, he needed a fresh start, and the idyllic charm of Willow Lane seemed the perfect place to begin again. He had hoped that this small, peaceful suburb would give him and his new wife Marie a fresh start, a clean slate away from the tumult of his previous life. But life had never been simple for Henry. For years, he had juggled the pressures of his job with the demands of family life, but it had been his personal failings that eventually tore his life apart. An affair with Marie started 1 year before the divorce. Henry had met Marie through Cece. Marie and Cece were friends, and she was nothing like Annie. Marie was older, more grounded, and had already lived a rich, full life that intertwined both professional accomplishments and personal joys. After a successful career in real estate, where she was renowned for her keen eye for opportunities and her ability to connect with clients, she had retired to focus on her family and passions. At nearly 70, Marie wasn't the obvious choice for a man in his early 40s, but her maturity and stability appealed to Henry in a way no one else had. She had a way of calming his chaos, of grounding him. However, Marie's journey had not been without its struggles. In her earlier years, she had faced significant challenges with alcohol, using it as a coping mechanism during particularly stressful times in her life, especially during her marriage, which ultimately ended in divorce. She recognized that her reliance on alcohol had created rifts in her relationships with her children and contributed to feelings of isolation. After hitting rock bottom, Marie sought help, attending therapy and support groups that emphasized the importance of community and self-reflection. She had been sober for over a decade now and had rebuilt her relationships with her children and others. Marie often spoke openly about her past, seeing it as a testament to her resilience rather than a point of shame. This willingness to share her struggles drew Henry closer to her. He admired her strength and her commitment to overcoming her past. Marie had 2 children, both of whom had grown up and started families. She loved being a grandmother and often spoke about her 3 grandkids, 2 boys and a girl, describing their antics and achievements with a sparkle in her eye. Marie was kind and nurturing. She seemed to understand the complexities of Henry's past without judgment, often sharing her own stories of triumph and heartache. Her presence made him feel like he could breathe again. For the first time in years, Henry felt as though he could leave behind the mess he had made of his life. Their relationship blossomed quickly. Henry fell for her hard and fast. Her laughter, her gentle wisdom, and her ability to make everything feel like it would be okay provided the emotional anchor he had so desperately needed. When Annie discovered her husband Henry's infidelity, it felt as though the ground had been ripped from beneath her. She was not just angry, she was consumed by a rage that bordered on madness. The sheer fact that he had cheated on her boiled her blood. But it was the age of the mistress that pushed her over the edge. The thought that Henry had opted for a woman nearly 3 decades older than her was a dagger to her heart, plunging deep into her insecurities and fears. It made her feel humiliated and belittled, as if he were publicly declaring her inadequacies as a wife. Annie felt as though Henry's choice was a blatant attempt to undermine her, to show her just how unattractive and inadequate he believed she was. She imagined him laughing behind her back, relishing the idea that he had upgraded to a better partner, one who brought a sense of calm and stability that she seemingly lacked. In her mind, this betrayal was not merely an affair, it was a direct assault on her identity as a woman. It felt like he was trying to ruin her, to strip away her confidence and worth. With each passing moment, her anger transformed into a burning hatred directed not only at Henry, but at Marie. In Annie's eyes, Marie represented everything that was morally reprehensible. She became the embodiment of betrayal, a woman who, having lived a full life, had now entered into her world to steal away the man she considered hers. It felt like a direct assault on her identity and her role as a mother. In her mind, Marie was not just a rival, she was the enemy. Annie couldn't help but use their son Joe as a weapon in her emotional battle. The thought of leaving her beloved son in the care of someone she considered morally low was unbearable. She felt an overwhelming duty to protect Joe from what she viewed as the toxic influence of both Henry and Marie. Annie began to manipulate situations to ensure Joe was kept from Henry as much as possible. Whenever Henry wanted to see their son, she would use it as leverage, scheduling activities that would inevitably conflict with his plans, creating an emotional barrier between father and son. Annie's desire for revenge often manifested in the way she spoke to Joe about his father. She couldn't help but plant seeds of doubt in his young mind. "Your dad has made some bad choices," she would say, subtly shaping Joe's perception of Henry, making the situation feel less about bringing Joe closer to his father and more about keeping him safe from a man she now viewed as untrustworthy. The anger became an integral part of her relationship with Joe, as her resentment toward Henry seeped into her parenting. She found herself on edge, and her frustration would often bubble over, causing her to lash out. "You don't need to be like him," she would remind Joe pointedly when he showed any sign of wanting to spend time with his father or expressed a desire to hear about the new woman in Henry's life. Annie's hatred consumed her, distorting her love for her son and affecting her daily life. She felt justified in her actions, believing that she was protecting Joe from an emotionally unsafe environment. Yet, the longer she held on to that anger, the more it engulfed her, leading her down a path of isolation and bitterness. Annie was fiercely determined to reclaim her sense of self-worth. When Annie got the news about Henry and Marie's wedding, she realized that this morally low-in-her-mind family should never be around Joe. She just refused to answer calls and didn't let Henry even hear from his son. That's when Henry decided to take an action and failed a court about custody over their son. In the sterile interrogation room, Annie Rowan sat with her hands cuffed to the metal table, her eyes red from crying. The air was thick with tension as Detective Harris stared at her, waiting for her to gather her thoughts amidst the chaos of the day. Annie stated that she had arrived at Henry's house with her mother, Cece. They had come to discuss custody of their son, Joe, but Annie brought Cece for protection just in case Henry reacted poorly. Both women had arrived before Henry, waiting for him with a sense of apprehension. As Harris pressed for details, she explained that she thought confronting Henry together would make him more reasonable. They had intended to talk, not fight. But when Henry arrived, his anger erupted like a volcano. His shouts filled the air, shattering any hope of a calm discussion. Annie stated that she had no idea why he was so angry, that he looked like something had already happened to him before he came into his house. Annie has never seen him as nervous and almost mad as she saw this night. She felt very scared for her life. As she can recall, Henry attacked her, but her mom Cece stood between them to protect her daughter. At the same moment, Annie ran to grab something to hit Henry and save her mother, who was in a state where he could kill Sissy. She found a gun cabinet, took 2 whips and 2 guns from there. In a hurry, Annie ran back. Henry was violently shaking Cece and pushing her from side to side. Annie attacked him. Her and Cece started to beat him with whips in pure state of affect, but he was punching back, so Annie took the gun from her coat and threatened him to stop. This moment, they all heard police sirens. Henry stopped his actions, and Annie had a chance to run and hide because of how scared she was. Detective listened closely, but something about her story didn't sit right. If Annie had only come to talk about custody, why had she and her mother been in the house before Henry even arrived? As the interrogation continued, Annie's story began to shift. We broke in, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. We were already inside when Henry got home. The plot thickened. Annie wasn't telling them everything, but it was clear that whatever had happened, the situation had turned violent. But why? And where was Henry's new wife, Marie? At the scene, the investigative team and medical examiners were already at work. They found 2 whips, 2 revolvers covered in blood, a rope, and 2 stun guns. Custody papers were lying next to them in blood. In the bedroom, the bed looked as if it had been turned upside down, with women's slippers lying beside it. By the fence, they discovered a backpack with suspicious contents. Inside were a rope, pliers, bullets, gloves, another stun gun, and a hammer. Also found was a prepared farewell note that appeared to be from Henry. As they moved through the area of the house, the officers spotted a shed near the porch that had a large padlock hanging from it. When they peeked through the hole in the wooden door, the officers were filled with sheer horror. In the shed stood an old bathtub that appeared to be filled with a pile of trash and items, but a human hand was clearly protruding from the debris. The police immediately broke the padlock, opened the gates, and in the pile of sheets, they found the body of an elderly woman. She was suffocated, her face purple and swollen. It didn't take long to identify her. Marie Rowan, Henry's new wife, the woman for whom he had left Annie. The discovery of Marie's body shifted the entire investigation. This wasn't just a case of domestic violence, it was a murder. As the investigation deepened, disturbing details began to surface, particularly concerning the events that transpired the day Annie and Cece arrived at Henry's house. It soon became clear that their visit was not merely a discussion about custody arrangements. They had come with a plan that extended far beyond a civil conversation. As soon as the detectives learned about the evidence that had been found and about Marie's body, it became even more obvious to them. They asked Annie directly if she and Cece had seen Marie when they arrived at Henry's house. Annie firmly stated that she had not been there. However, when they asked if she had seen the body in the shed behind the house, Annie's lip quivered. She clearly began to panic and struggled to find her words. "No, I don't know anything about the body," she replied. In another interrogation room, Henry sat and was visibly shaken and disheveled. The shock of the day's events was evident as he fidgeted with his fingers on the table. As the detective began his questioning, Henry recounted the chaotic evening. He described arriving home to find his ex-wife Annie and her mother Cece waiting for him with weapons in hand. In an attempt to de-escalate the situation, he tried to reason with them, but it quickly turned violent. Cece and Annie attacked him with stun guns and whips, knocking him to the floor. Henry was helpless, unable to fight back as they pinned him down, his body racked with pain from the electric shocks. They continued to beat him with whips and their feet, delivering blow after blow, totaling approximately 70 to 90 strikes. This went on for at least 20 minutes. This horrifying scene and the agony of helpless Henry were unimaginable. In a state of complete shock and in an attempt to defend himself, Henry began to strike his attackers with his arms and legs. He was able to hit Cece, striking her in the face and bringing her down to him. Just when Henry had a glimmer of hope for his own salvation and started to struggle with Cece, Annie pulled a revolver from her coat and aimed it at him. Annie, face twisted with rage. "Sign the papers, Henry!" she snarled, shoving the custody agreement into his face. Henry's hands trembled as he reached for the custody papers, his mind spinning from the pain and shock. The stun gun had left him disoriented, his vision blurry and his body unresponsive. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to comprehend what was happening. "Sign it!" Cece hissed again, her eyes blazing with fury. Annie stood behind her, clutching the gun with both hands, her body shaking but her resolve clear. Henry, drenched in sweat and blood, felt a deep pang of betrayal. Henry's voice was a broken rasp. Why are you doing this?" he choked out. Annie flinched, the gun trembling in her hands. Her lips quivered as she tried to speak, but Cece's cold, controlling presence loomed over her, pushing her forward. Cece stepped closer to Henry, her face inches from his. "Sign it or she'll shoot you." Henry knew he had no choice. His life dangled precariously before him, and any hope of getting out of this alive depended on his compliance. He cried and screamed in pain, his lips moved shakingly. "I'll sign, please stop. I'll do anything, just stop," his lips trembling as he spoke. Everything stopped as soon as the three of them heard the sirens outside the house. In a panic, Annie ran downstairs while Cece threatened Henry, saying that if he said anything or screamed, Annie would kill Marie. Henry's side of the story added that missing puzzle that detectives were looking for. The cruelty of plan and violence that this too fragile from the first look women could bring to the peaceful family is enormous. Annie's motive was clear for them, but what pushed Cece to this crime? It was, in fact, not just the desire to help her beloved daughter, but her own deep, dark internal motives. The affair with Cece had begun long before the divorce, something that Henry hadn't meant to happen, but that had spiraled out of his control. Cece had entered their lives under the guise of help. When Joe, Henry, and Annie's son had been born, Cece moved in to assist her daughter with the challenges of new motherhood. At first, everything seemed ideal. Cece was attentive, caring, and warm, but as the months went by, her attention shifted toward Henry. She was unlike any woman he had ever known, mature, alluring, and exuding a confidence that Annie lacked in her exhaustion as a new mother. Henry didn't know how to resist. At first, their interactions were innocent, late-night conversations over wine after Annie had gone to bed, Cece's laughter at his jokes, her hand lingering just a moment too long on his arm. She had a way of making him feel seen in a way Annie hadn't in years. Cece's presence was intoxicating, drawing Henry into a dangerous web of flirtation and temptation. When it finally happened, when Cece leaned in one night and kissed him, it felt both inevitable and shocking. Henry had never planned to cheat on Annie. He had never imagined himself as the type of man to betray his wife, but Cece was different. She wasn't some random fling, she was family, and that made it all the more dangerous. What started as a brief, impulsive affair quickly escalated. The thrill of secrecy, the danger of being caught, it all added to the allure. They met in hidden moments, stolen glances turning into hurried, clandestine encounters. But guilt gnawed at Henry. Every time he saw his wife and son, every time he sat down to dinner with them, he felt a wave of self-loathing. He knew it couldn't last. Cece, on the other hand, had no such qualms. She enjoyed the power she held over him. She relished the fact that Henry was willing to risk his marriage for her, and she began pushing for more. What had once been an exciting diversion for Henry was becoming a suffocating trap. The affair continued until the day Henry met Marie. He couldn't live the lie anymore. He told Annie about Marie and asked for divorce, but he kept the affair with Cece hidden. Cece introduced Henry to Mary. Marie was her longtime friend. They often went together to play bingo or attended church on Sundays. Cece didn't notice any spark between Marie and Henry, so when he finally confessed to her and said that he was going to leave her, Annie, and this house altogether, Cece was in complete shock. But this shock quickly turned into hatred. Cece's rage was more than just anger over Henry's rejection. It was born out of humiliation that he didn't leave Annie but escaped her. In Cece's mind, Marie had stolen Henry and her happiness. She was in despair over Henry's betrayal, but most of all, over the betrayal of her friend Marie, completely forgetting her own betrayal of her daughter. Thoughts constantly crept into Cece's mind about how treacherous Marie was and how she had been planning this all for years. She began to cling to the details as if she had somehow figured out about her and Henry and also wanted a romance in her old age. It seemed that Mary had hated her and wanted to harm her whole life, and now a perfect opportunity had presented itself. Her head was boiling with thoughts that Henry didn't love her, that he had deceived her, that he had used and seduced her. She and her daughter were victims of the treacherous plans of Marie and Henry. Cece's love for Henry had twisted into something dark, something vengeful. Cece was constantly reminding Annie how treacherous these people were, manipulating her daughter into the idea that they will take full custody over Joe and after will use him in their twisted sex life, that Henry and Marie are definitely into some sex cult and that Marie was telling her stories about this cult when Cece and her were friends. Annie, on the other hand, was torn between her mother's manipulation and her own conflicted feelings. Her heartbreak turned to anger. And that anger, stoked by Cece's lies, began to consume her. Cece's whispers clouded her mind, convincing her that eliminating Marie and Henry was the only way to reclaim Joe. The plan began to take shape. Cece and Annie would broke into the house that night while Henry was out. They had planned every detail, down to the way they would dispose of the body. Marie didn't stand a chance. They approached the bed where Marie was sleeping, paralyzed her with a taser, and continued her suffering by placing a rope around her neck, strangling her to death. When Marie's lifeless body lay before them, without hesitation, Annie and Cece dragged Marie's body to the shed, put her in the old bath covered with all the sheets Marie was sleeping in. After finishing their sinister preparations, they began to wait. After plan was to ambush him, torture and force him to sign over custody of Joe and then kill him, making it look like a murder-suicide. Henry would take the blame for Marie's death through a suicide letter and they would finally be free from his control. Nothing, of course, went according to plan except blood-chilling, remorseless killing of innocent Marie. When Henry was delivered news about Marie, he just fell into hysteria. "I didn't know!" Henry screamed, his face buried in his hands. "I didn't know they'd hurt her! Marie, God, she didn't deserve this!" In another room, news were taken with another approach. "She deserved it," Cece said coldly when asked about Marie. "Henry took everything from me. I just took it back." Annie was brought back into the interrogation room. When she learned the truth, that her mother had betrayed her in the worst way imaginable, her screams echoed through the station. Annie's breakdown was the final piece of the puzzle. The truth had finally come out, and with it, any hope of redemption for Cece was lost. She had manipulated everyone, Henry, Annie, and even herself, driven by a toxic combination of love, betrayal, and a desire for revenge. The trial became a media sensation. The salacious details of the case, a love affair, a murder, and a tangled web of lies, captivated the public's attention. Cece stood trial for first-degree murder, while Annie was charged with a second-degree murder, as detectives found out that it is Cece who was a real mastermind behind their cruel plan. Both women sat in the courtroom, their fates hanging in the balance. Henry testified against them, his voice filled with raw emotion as he recounted the events of that fateful night. The pain of betrayal, the fear for his life, and the loss of Marie all weighed heavily on him. In the end, the jury found Cece guilty of murder and she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Annie, though clearly manipulated by her mother, was not spared from justice. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison for her role in the conspiracy, a lighter sentence but still a devastating blow. Henry was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. He had lost Marie, the woman he loved, and his relationship with Annie, once so full of promise, was now irreparably damaged. His son Joe would grow up knowing the truth of what had happened, a truth that would haunt them both for years to come. Cece now languished in prison, her life reduced to a series of cold gray walls. Annie, though devastated by her mother's betrayal, would spend her years in prison reflecting on the choices she had made, the family she had lost, and the life she had destroyed. In the end, no one had truly won. The weight of betrayal, the pain of loss, and the consequences of their actions left all of them broken in different ways. What had started as a simple desire for revenge had spiraled into a nightmare from which none of them would ever fully escape. Henry's helplessness, Annie's regret, and Cece's cold rage would remain etched in their memories forever. A reminder of the fragile line between love and hatred, and the devastating cost of crossing it.